Okay. Let's talk. So, if you've been familiar with the channel, which if you haven't, subscribe right now, this is a thread. In the past couple of years, I've talked a whole lot about Hollywood being stuck in a state of what I like to call franchise supremacy, aka studios want that paper and they almost exclusively bank on franchises and recognizable IPs, which is why it feels like that's all we see in theaters these days. The rise of that phenomenon started to happen in the very late 2000s, but mostly became prominent and largely unavoidable in the 2010s. And that decade was quite transformative for Hollywood. We saw a very specific shift in studios' race for the next big franchise. From comic book movies, video game adaptations, the YA novel adaptation craze of the 2010s, you know it, you've seen it. And obviously now, in the 2020s, we are so overexposed to it that it's almost become laughable. And while we can give a lot of shit to the studios for constantly shoving franchises down our throats, audiences also have their part of the blame in this. After all, studios only speak through money, and audiences communicate to studios with their wallets. And there is an undeniable truth that despite audiences being consistently frustrated with this franchise supremacy, these franchise movies still bring a whole lot of money at the box office. If you take a look at the highest grossing movies of the past 5 years, they are almost exclusively franchise films. And that's not the studio's fault, that's just people going to see those movies. Hell, I think I talked about it already in a previous video, but the 10 highest grossing movies of last year, 2024, is entirely composed of sequels, at the exception of Wicked, which is still a franchise movie. I talk about that in more detail in a video I made about 2024 blockbusters, so please go see that if you haven't, but you get the point. In a way, we audiences and the studios are currently in a toxic relationship, if you will. We hate what they're giving us, but we always go back for more. And as long as we keep giving them money for franchises, they will keep pumping out franchise projects, and sometimes they get very desperate to do so. I was recently reminded of one very specific story about a failed attempt at starting a franchise that I found so brutal that it genuinely made me feel secondhand embarrassment for a studio. And I told myself this might be one of Hollywood's worst ever attempts at starting a franchise. Just a prime example of how greed and business-oriented decisions lead studios to rush through things or to force things to happen that shouldn't happen, and eventually leads them to bombastic failures and, losing a fuckload of money. The studios love their money, and sometimes their obsessive desire for it completely clouds their judgments and makes them push for decisions that are so obviously stupid that you wonder how they even let certain things happen in the first place. That has reminded me of other desperate attempts at starting franchises that ended in disasters. Some I will keep for other videos, but specifically here today, there are 5 I want to talk about that I find completely insane. Not only for how those attempts turned out, but also for the sheer amount of disjointed-ass shenanigans that happen behind the scenes that just reminds you that sometimes people running these major studios are kinda stupid. You'll get what I mean as I yap about it, so without further ado, let's take quite an extensive look at some of Hollywood's worst attempts at starting franchises. Number 5. Power Rangers. Okay, this needs context. Listen up. In 2014, a filmmaker named Joseph Kahn, who is mostly known for directing music videos, joined forces with producer Adi Shankar to make a short Power Rangers fan film for YouTube. Titled Power Rangers Unauthorized, the short was released on February 23rd, 2015, and it took the internet by storm. Because this isn't a small-scale little fan film. No. They put the bar very high, with the cast alone. Despite the fact that Power Rangers Unauthorized is a fan film, the movie stars Katie Sackhoff, James Van Der Beek, and Will Yun Lee in a dark and gritty reimagining of the mighty morphing Power Rangers, who are now being hunted down years after having been defeated by the Machine Empire. Power Rangers Unauthorized takes place in a future where the Rangers are now adults and fugitives, being hunted down and murdered by an enemy they failed to stop and that now rules the world. The story follows an adult Kimberly Hart, the Pink Ranger, played here by Katie Sackhoff, who is captured and interrogated by Rocky DeSantos, the second Red Ranger, played by James Van Der Beek, who has betrayed the Power Rangers and joined the Machine Empire.
Bullshit is an ugly color on you.
So yeah, the guy who directed Look What You Made Me Do by Taylor Swift, Thunder by Imagine Dragons, Love the Way You Lie by Eminem and Rihanna, and Womanizer by Britney Spears teamed up with the producer of Castlevania and Dread to make a dark and gritty Power Rangers short film for YouTube, and it actually kinda slapped. Power Rangers Unauthorized is a badass fan film. It has incredible production value. A lot of effort was put in the visual effects. There's a couple of really impressive fight scenes, a great twist, and more generally, the fact that a fan film can have such a stacked cast was kind of unheard of at the time. This 15-minute short rightfully made a lot of noise online and garnered tens of millions of views as people praised the daring vision of making Power Rangers a dark story that acknowledges the pitfalls of taking a group of kids and giving them mighty powers to go to war, and being aimed at a more mature audience that likely grew up with a version of the kids show. It was an absolute success, and everyone was happy. Except for Saban Entertainment, the company that owned the rights to Power Rangers at the time. A couple days after the release of the fan film, Saban Entertainment decided to throw a temper tantrum and had YouTube take down the video, claiming some sort of copyright violation. But due to the immense outrage from fans that quickly got extremely overwhelming for them and giving them headlines painting them as greedy assholes, the company caved and reversed their decision 24 hours later, and the film was restored. And this whole ordeal only gave the fan film way more attention. Now, the reason why Saban Entertainment was so quick to go after the film and try to delete it is because they had their own Power Rangers movie in development with Lionsgate, a movie that had been announced a few months earlier in May of 2014. They were aiming at reinvigorating the IP with a new franchise for modern audiences, but this fan film that shocked the internet was taking a lot of attention away from what they were working on, and they didn't like that. They were kind of already struggling to get people interested in this new movie, and now this was completely overshadowing the project. However, after throwing this pathetic fit, Saban decided to use their brains and follow the trail. Basically, the audience's response and universal praise towards the fan film was so overpowering that it influenced the actual development of the new movie, inspiring Saban Entertainment and Lionsgate to rework their own project with a darker and grittier tone, set in a more grounded and realistic atmosphere. And so they got to work, and that movie was released in theaters in 2017. And, oh boy, where do we start? Power Rangers 2017 stars Dacre Montgomery, Naomi Scott, Becky G, Bryan Cranston, and Elizabeth Banks? What? This is the most randomized cast of all time. Anyways, the movie is a new origin story for the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers that takes direct inspiration from popular movies of the 2010s like Chronicle and The Amazing Spider-Man. Like, it was trying to emulate a certain kind of blockbuster in the hopes of reaching a larger audience. And personally, I remember the movie being fine. All things considered, it wasn't all that memorable, but it also wasn't that bad in my memory. The story itself was kinda lame and generic. It was trying a little too hard to be edgy. The directing was very hit or miss. The movie looked kind of ugly. The characters were flat, badly written, and overall not very memorable. It wasn't awful, but the movie lacked personality. It played everything a little too safe, and I remember the third act losing me completely. I fucking hated the final battle, but I'll be honest, I barely remember anything about the movie. It really was quite forgettable. This movie feels like it was rushed, like it wasn't done to really tell a story that needed being told, but really to start a franchise, and that's ultimately the biggest problem with Power Rangers 2017. It's simply that Saban and Lionsgate got a little too greedy, a little too fast. Because Power Rangers is such a recognizable property, instead of focusing on making one great film that could be built on later on, they wanted to be in franchise mode from the get-go. So before the first movie was even completed, they had already announced that this would be the first of 7 films, with a 6-film story arc already worked out by the studio. They made such a gigantic deal out of it and advertised this as the next big Hollywood franchise. The problem was, nobody gave a shit. Nobody was convinced by this movie. The first trailer that was released in 2016 was heavily disliked by practically everybody, and it was slammed for being extremely underwhelming and looking incredibly cheap despite the massive $100 million budget that was reported. And it completely killed any kind of hype for the project, so I don't know why the studio thought it was smart to try and convince people to be into one movie by saying, hey, you know this movie you all think kind of looks like shit? Good news! We want to make 7 of them. Like, seriously, that was kind of a surefire way to make everyone avoid this film like the fucking plague. And they did. So yeah, the movie flopped, and it flopped really hard. Nobody really went to see it, nobody was interested in it, so much so that it is estimated that at the end of its road, Power Rangers 2017 lost the studio around $74 million.
Me personally, I wouldn't take this level of disrespect.
For Saban Entertainment and all the loud talking they'd been doing, this was an embarrassment of gigantic proportions. And to tell you just how embarrassing, the movie was released on March 24th, 2017. Just 6 weeks later, in May of 2017, it was already being reported that the studio doubted the sequels would ever happen. And just a year later, on May 1st, 2018, Saban Entertainment would end up getting rid of the Power Rangers IP altogether. They sold the rights to Power Rangers to Hasbro and wiped their hands clean from the disaster they created. Since then, Hasbro has killed the sequel ideas, and in 2019, they announced a reboot that would restart the franchise from scratch, but that was almost 7 years ago, and that reboot is nowhere to be seen. It's been stuck in development hell for years, and I don't think we're gonna see it anytime soon. Oh, and by the way, fun fact for the absolute irony of it all, not only did Saban Entertainment cave and was forced to allow the fan film to exist against their will, they eventually did approach Adi Shankar and asked him to produce and write a new, dark, and mature Power Rangers TV series based on the Power Rangers unauthorized fan film he made. That project ultimately died in development, it never got off the ground and went nowhere. But I do think it's hilarious that the company pulled such a 180 because they were so floored by how adored this unofficial short film was. An entire multi-million-dollar franchise defeated by a 15-minute fan film. Number 4. Red Sonja. Oh boy. This one's gonna take a minute. Okay, so for anyone who isn't familiar with Red Sonja, let's give a quick little tiny witty breakdown. Red Sonja is a Marvel Comics character created in 1973 by Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor Smith as a part of the Conan the Barbarian series. The character became incredibly popular with readers in a very short amount of time due to this little thing called over-sexualization. And she eventually got her own spin-off series just a couple years later that was ongoing for decades. Sometime in the 2000s, the character was taken over by Dynamite Comics, who has been at her helm ever since. Essentially, she's being reinvented every few years by different writers. She's been through different eras, some fantastic, others not so fantastic. There was a weird period of time in the comics where Mary Jane Watson is revealed to be the reincarnation of Red Sonja. So Red Sonja turns out to be the secret identity of Spider Spider-Man's girlfriend, but that was very short-lived. Everybody was very eager to forget it ever happened, and we don't talk about that. Forget about it, okay? The point is, Red Sonja is an old-school comic character that has remained popular for over 50 years now, and she has a very strong cult following. Okay, basics established, now comes the stories of movie adaptations. In 1985, a Red Sonja movie was released in theaters. The movie starred Brigitte Nielsen and Arnold Schwarzenegger and was directed by Richard Fleischer, who is mostly known for having directed the movie Soylent Green, one of the most fucked up films of the 70s. Anyways, I'm not gonna stay on this one too long. Red Sonja 1985 was a gigantic box office bomb and one of the most critically panned movies of the 1980s, which is saying something because the 80s is kind of synonymous with shitty, critically panned B-movies. Everybody hated this thing, but despite its crushing failure on virtually every level, a sequel was put in development in 1986. If I understand correctly, initially the same cast was going to return along with the director, but the project very quickly started to stall and it got delayed for months and months on end, entering the dreaded universe of development hell. A development hell that lasted a very, very short period of 16 years. Yeah, it's only around March of 2002 that it was confirmed the Red Sonja project was still active, but no longer as a sequel to the 1985 film, but as a reboot set to start a new, big-scale franchise. But even after that announcement, the movie remained stuck in development hell for years. It was an absolute mess behind the scenes. Nothing was working out. Scripts kept getting scrapped, and the few people that had attached themselves to the project quietly left, never to be mentioned again. It's in 2005, a whole 3 years later, and 20 years after the first movie, that there was finally some movement. Director Robert Rodriguez, who at the time was coming off the hype of his movies Spy Kids and Sin City, signed on to direct the Red Sonja reboot. And Rose McGowan, who was just coming off of Charmed, joined the project to play the titular character. I remember being so fucking excited at the time this was announced, and I waited for news of the movie like a maniac. I could not wait to finally see this thing. But then 2005 went by, 2006 came and went, and nothing. No news of the movie. But then, at the very beginning of 2007, it happened. The official posters of the movie were released, both online and displayed in movie theaters, revealing Rose McGowan as Red Sonja for the very first time, and officially announcing a 2009 release date. And fuck me. Look at this shit. These posters go so hard for no fucking reason. You could tell the vibe was heavily influenced by Robert Rodriguez's success with Sin City. This movie was going to be dark and gothic as hell, and Rose McGowan looked fucking amazing in the role.
Then I came home and I said, have you ever heard of Red Sonja? I kind of think this is kick-ass.
When I read the script, I could see why she responded to it, and it's not quite like Planet Terror, where she doesn't really turn into Machine Gun Girl till the last 2 minutes. So she really gets to, she becomes Red Sonja with red, fiery hair pretty quick into it, like 12 minutes into the movie. So
the hype was real. The excitement was palpable. The fans were ready, me included. I could not wait for this thing to finally be out. 2009 could not come soon enough. Anyway, so the movie never came out. Despite the posters, the interviews, the hype, etc., etc., for some reason that I don't think was ever revealed, the 2009 Red Sonja movie never actually went into production. They never shot the fucking thing. And after years of speculation, around 2012, so 3 years after the intended release date, Rose McGowan and Robert Rodriguez both exited the project, leaving it with no director and no star, and thus began another decade of disastrous behind-the-scenes chaos. At some point, Jamie Alexander was attached to the role. She even confirmed that she had read a script, but nothing happened. Amber Heard was set to play Red Sonja sometime in the 2010s. That died. There was even a point where Bryan Singer was going to direct the movie, but then, he was revealed to be a fucking creep who sexually assaults people, so he was fired. Like, nothing was going on here. The project was a mess and nobody could get it off the ground.
So do you think that this Red Sonja movie is ever going to happen, or because they have it, they have the rights to it, are we just dead in the water until the rights lapse?
Oh, gosh. I could see it still happening, but not this year.
Yeah.
I think that projects like this don't tend to just go away. Eventually it'll resurface again.
I'd be surprised if any A-list actress or burgeoning A-list actress ever takes this on at this point. And if you want this thing to survive, the last thing you want is a C movie or B movie actress taking this thing over. It won't get the buzz that you want it to get.
Quick reminder that this reboot was announced in 2002, bruv. This movie was announced when the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man was coming out. This movie was announced a whole year before the first Pirates of the Caribbean. And 20 years later, almost 40 years after the first movie, they still don't have a script, they don't have a director, they don't have a star. By 2019, a 7th director had signed on, and actress Hannah John Kamen, who most people probably now know as Ghost in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, was officially cast as Red Sonja. And then, once again, radio silence until 2022, when it was announced that both the star and the director had once again decided to fuck off from the project. Another director came in to replace the old one, and eventually Matilda Lutz was cast in the role, and then we got news that the movie was maybe about to start shooting sometime soon, although I wasn't too hopeful. And I'm gonna tell you something fucking hilarious now. I was about to finish this section of the video by giving you guys like a whole speech about my expectations for the movie that is finally being made, like what my hopes are for it, what I think they're gonna do, what I think they should do, what comic I hope they take inspiration from, what it's gonna be like when it finally comes out, and I can't. I can't? Because I just found out a few minutes ago, the movie already came out. Yeah, the movie came out back in August, and I didn't know. It wasn't really promoted, aside from one throwaway trailer that came out just 4 weeks before the release. Like, they just sent this movie out to die. I don't know if you realize, I have been following Red Sonja's trail for around 20 years. I've been following this project so closely, every development, every bit of news for 2 decades. And in the end, after all of this, after the impossible race to finally get it done, the movie's release was such an afterthought for the studio that I somehow missed it. I didn't notice it was out, and I don't think anybody really did notice, because it did really poorly. Red Sonja had an incredibly small budget of only $17 million, which is absolutely crazy to think about, but despite that, it only grossed around $200,000 at the box office before being sent straight to video on demand just a couple weeks later. When I say this movie was sent out to die, I was not kidding. This movie was DOA, my guy, dead on arrival. I haven't seen it, so there isn't much of an opinion for me to share here, but everything I've heard from the few people who have is not giving any confidence. The trailer alone shows how dated the movie looks. It looks like a low-budget B-movie you would have found in the $1 DVD section of a store back in the year 2001. And what the fuck is Robert Sheehan doing here?
Bonsoir.
Anyway, so all dreams for a big, epic Red Sonja franchise trilogy or whatever is completely dead in the water now. It sucks because she's a character with an insane amount of potential and a lot of very interesting themes. It could make for an epic action fantasy series of movies with a lot of heart and great characters, but we did all of this for that. What an anticlimactic end to 40 years of longing. Wild. And believe me, the next entries are somehow even worse. But before we continue, do you guys ever hear about a show or a movie that people are talking about on the internet, but you just can't seem to find where you can watch it? Because that happened to me very recently, and let me tell you, I wasn't happy. That's because I live in Canada and Hulu is not available here, meaning I couldn't watch the new season of The Bear when it came out, which is messed up because I love The Bear, it's really good. But thankfully my pain did not last because ExpressVPN swooped in and said, broski, we got you. ExpressVPN allows you to switch your IP address's location and access streaming services all around the world. I can literally trick Hulu into thinking I'm in the US and boom, now I can watch The Bear. And not only that, ExpressVPN also makes your internet navigation way more secure. Because yeah, Gary, if you think nobody knows you're watching porn at work just because you're using incognito mode, you're wrong. Your internet provider can see everything you're doing. Using a VPN, however, ensures you're basically invisible while surfing the web, and in turn makes it way more difficult for advertisers and big tech companies to track you online, which you would want because imagine going to the bathroom in a public space, but there's a huge window and everybody can look at you while you're doing your business. Well, newsflash, if you're not using a VPN, that's pretty much what you're doing. But guess what? You guys are in luck because ExpressVPN is hooking you up. Right now, if you go to expressvpn.com/spaceninja, you can get 4 extra months of ExpressVPN for free. That is 4 months of basically being Batman. You can go around on the internet more protected and more anonymous than ever, and you can watch any movie or show you want by switching your location with a single click. And life is just better that way. So remember, go to expressvpn.com/spaceninja and find out how you can get 4 months for free. Thank you so much to ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the show. Number 3. Eragon. So when I was like 11 years old, I picked up this fantasy novel called Eragon that was written by Christopher Paolini. I remember there was this whole mythology around this author saying he wrote the book when he was only 16 years old, and everyone was so impressed that he managed to publish something so big at such a young age. It's not exactly true though. He didn't write the whole book when he was 16. He was like 19 when it was finished and published, but he did start writing it when he was only 15, and even if it took him a few years, that's kind of impressive. Eragon is the story of a young farm boy named Eragon who goes hunting and finds a mysterious blue stone, which turns out to be a dragon egg, a species believed to be extinct. Dragon riders used to be the heroes of this world, but they were all eradicated when one of their own turned against them and took over the kingdom. So Eragon is taken under the wing of a mysterious man named Braum, who is secretly the last surviving dragon rider, living in hiding after the massacre of his peers and the murder of his own dragon at the hands of Morzan, the rider who betrayed them. Braum decides to train Eragon and his dragon, Saphira, and they band together to take on the evil Empire. Okay, whatever. It's basically the exact plot of Star Wars, but with dragons, okay? Aragorn is Luke Skywalker, Braum is Obi-Wan Kenobi, Morzan is Vader, and the big bad King Galbatorix is the Emperor. There's even a princess named Arya who is rescued by the heroes and assumes the role of Leia. It's Star Wars. Now, I'm not surprising many fans here. Eragon has been criticized a lot for its lack of originality. It was accused of ripping off a lot of previous works of fantasy that are way more iconic, but with all that said, Eragon was still a smash hit when it came out, and my little child self loved that fucking novel. I did read the second book, but it put me to sleep and I never finished the saga, but I hear it actually gets really good after a while. Anyway, that's not the point. A few months after I picked up that first book in 2006, there was a movie adaptation of Eragon that came out in theaters. And let me tell you, 12-year-old me was very excited. My best friend and I harassed our parents to let us go see it opening night. We did, and the movie sucks! Like, holy shit, this movie is bad! We are operating at a very low level here. This shit is whack! It is one of the most boring fantasy films of the 2000s, and believe me, that's saying something, because the 2000s had a lot of fantasy films to go around, and most of them were garbage, but this one stuck with me because of how bad it was. The Eragon movie was directed by Stefan Fangmeier, who is mostly known for having directed nothing. Yeah, this isn't a joke. Stefan isn't a movie director. He is a visual effects supervisor and consultant. He had never directed anything before Eragon, and he hasn't directed anything since Eragon. Now, why a gigantic fantasy franchise with a $100 million budget was handed to a first-time director with no experience? I will never understand. The movie was also directed by a man named Peter Buchman, who, before Eragon, had only ever written one movie, that movie being Jurassic Park 3, aka the one nobody likes. And he was only one of 3 writers on that film, but somehow they just handed him Eragon. And why? Whoever put together the team to make that movie, my guy, do you need a Kit Kat? Necesito un Kit Kat, broski? Because despite the catastrophic team of very inexperienced people being handed such a massive undertaking, the movie did somehow manage to have quite a stellar cast, with John Malkovich as the villain, Braum being played by Jeremy Irons, Robert Carlyle as Durza, Ed Speleers, Jamon Hunsu, and fuck me, even Saphira the Dragon is voiced by Rachel Weisz. This cast goes hard, and everyone in this cast is wasted in this movie. No exception, everyone is asleep in their roles. It's actually kinda wild. First of all, the script is catastrophic. I actually read the whole thing, don't ask. And it is just bad, and you can very much see it in the movie. It is devoid of anything resembling a personality. The dialogue is 90% exposition. The characters are flat. There's no life to anything. Despite the incredible cast, the performances are pretty bad, and while the movie has pretty impressive visual effects for the time, it overall looks very bland and generic. Nothing stands out in this movie. Everything is pretty bad, and it's not helped by the fact that for fans of the books, the Eragon movie is a fairly inaccurate adaptation that doesn't even seem that interested in its own source material. I remember this one scene where I laughed in the theater because Saphira flies up in the sky for the first time as a baby dragon, and then there is like a random flash of light, and she suddenly becomes an adult dragon and flies back down to Eragon, and he's just like, what the fuck? Why are you an adult now? That doesn't happen in the book. Eragon raises Saphira until she becomes grown. But in the film, she just randomly turns into an adult because the writers were too lazy to convey the passage of time in the script. And they just didn't have any time to get anything in the book right. Because yeah, by the way, Eragon is a pretty thick book. The movie is only about an hour and 40 minutes long, and it's trying to pack things from a like 600-page novel. And mind you, I don't even think the novel is that good, and the second novel is also kind of boring. But even with that, there is something about this movie that is just so lifeless. It's a movie that entirely feels like it exists solely because those YA fantasy films were popular at the time and the studio just forced it to happen. Nobody involved in this movie seems like they want to be there. There's no depth to this movie, there's no soul to this movie, there's absolutely nothing memorable about this movie. Anyway, so Eragon came out in December of 2006, and it was, unsurprisingly, a disaster. In terms of critical response and audience response, this was kind of a worst case scenario. This thing was blasted when it came out, and I mean blasted. Everybody fucking hated it. It was kind of insane how negative the response was. Box office wise, the movie wildly underperformed, but did moderately okay, enough to break even, but not nearly enough to satisfy the studio, let alone to justify making a sequel. It performed kind of terribly in all of the major markets. It apparently was saved by France, where it randomly made a lot of money, but it flopped in the UK, it flopped in the US, it flopped in Canada, it did sort of okay in Australia, and at the end of the road, despite being one of the most expensive movies of that year, Eragon didn't even crack the top 10 highest grossing movies of 2006. It actually came in 16th place. That's fucking crazy. So naturally, the sequels were cancelled and never fucking saw the light of day. This franchise died so fucking fast, it's honestly a little mind-blowing. However, back in 2022, it was announced by the author of the novels, Christopher Paolini, that an Eragon reboot is in the works, this time to be adapted as a TV series for Disney+. Paolini was going to be writing the series and be very involved in the overall production, but that was almost 4 years ago, and nothing has happened since. We do know the project is still in development. Christopher has been consistently giving updates about it, but the updates are like really weird. There's a few tweets where he rambles about contract negotiations taking forever, some interviews where he talks about how he's doing 90% of the writing and that he wrote 4 scripts for the series in 2024. It's kind of messy. And actually, in July of this year, in 2025, he tweeted that he is still submitting scripts revisions to Disney for the series. And then his latest update at the time of recording this video is from July 11th, where he said in a tweet, quote, "We're making real progress, no guarantees, but looking good at the moment." So long story short, this series has been stuck in development hell for almost half a decade, and they're still not really sure if this show is actually going to happen. They're not even done with the scripts anyway, so there's no cast, no production date, nothing. So even if this project does happen somehow, do not expect to see an Eragon series on your screens before like 2028. And that's if they get their shit together now. But there is a world where this comes out closer to 2030. But I'm honestly not all that convinced it's really gonna happen at all. I might be wrong, but I don't have a lot of faith. Number 2. Mortal Engines. Now, no, this is not a mistake. I didn't get the title wrong. I am not talking about Mortal Instruments, even though that was also a pretty big flop that failed to start a franchise. I should make a video about that. But this is a different movie. Most of you watching this video right now have probably never heard about it, and I think that's kind of funny. This one's gonna be quick, there isn't that much to say. So in a few words, Mortal Engines is a movie that came out in 2018, and that is an adaptation of a 2001 novel of the same name. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic steampunk dystopia, where cities are now giant vehicles on wheels that consume each other for survival, as a result of a destructive war that left the world damaged beyond repair. We follow 2 strangers named Hester and Tom, who have to band together in this hostile world to stop a dark conspiracy involving the city of London. The movie is actually kind of stacked. It stars Hugo Weaving, Stephen Lang, Pre Bridgerton, Regé-Jean Page, and Robert Sheehan? Again? Bro! Even if it was a mistake and I had been talking about Mortal Instruments, you were in that movie too! My brother in Christ, you have talent! Book one good movie, please! Oh my god! But the main pitch for Mortal Engines wasn't its source material, it wasn't its cast either. The main pitch was Peter Jackson. That's right, the director behind the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which is largely regarded as the greatest trilogy in the history of cinema, is behind this film. And it was very much pitched as his grand return to big-scale movies. And you couldn't miss it. His name is all over the trailers. The marketing campaign never missed an opportunity to yell on every roof that Peter Jackson was behind this movie, and this was going to be the next Lord of the Rings, so much so that to this day, in the big 2025, people still largely believe that Mortal Engines was directed by Peter Jackson, but it wasn't. The movie was actually directed by a man named Christian Rivers, but you wouldn't know that. Mortal Engines is his first and only movie to date. But because this movie was marketed as Peter Jackson's big return to big budget cinema, everybody assumed he directed it, when really, he just co-wrote the screenplay with two other writers and he acted as a producer. I just love how misleading these marketing campaigns can be. The fact that they put his name everywhere so that people would believe he actually directed it is not a coincidence. They did this shit on purpose because they did not believe in this movie. So yes, just like Aragon, this is yet another case of a giant movie with a budget of $150 million being handed over to a first-time director with no experience. And it shows. Which is crazy because Universal wanted this to be a massive franchise, since the Mortal Engines novel is the first of a series of 4 books known as the Mortal Engines Quartet. It is very obvious that they had big plans for this, especially considering how heavily they marketed it. But despite some popular trailers that showcase some pretty cool visuals, Mortal Engines failed to generate any real hype with audiences. Nobody really cared, nobody really talked about it, and so despite the studio's best efforts to make people notice it, Mortal Engines came out in December of 2018, and it was a complete disaster. Like a cataclysmic earthquake of a disaster. Seriously, it makes absolutely no sense for a movie like this to flop this fucking hard. Mortal Engines crashed and burned at the box office after being absolutely brutalized by negative reviews. And rightfully so. This is a movie that banked absolutely everything on visuals. And hey, the movie looks great. The production design is crazy. The visual effects are clean as fuck. There are some really cool shots and visuals in this movie. But that's kind of it. Cool visuals is legitimately all this movie has to offer. The rest of it is so insanely dull and uninteresting, it's like a sleeping pill in movie form. The cast is stacked, but everyone is asleep at the wheel. You don't give a fuck about any of the characters, protagonists or antagonists. The story is boring as hell. It's impossible to feel invested in anything that's going on. All of it comes out dry and tedious. So naturally, nobody cared, and since there was already very little hype about it, nobody felt like spending money to go see it once the first reviews came out and reiterated over and over again how not worth it the movie is. Okay, so compared to the other entries on this list, nothing about Mortal Engines seems to stand out as a case of a worst attempt at starting a franchise, so why am I talking about this? This just sounds like a regular story of a box office bomb. Well, what makes it stand out is the numbers. Like I said earlier, Mortal Engines had a reported budget of $150 million, and that's not including the cost of the lengthy marketing campaign it had, which would probably take that number at way over 200 million, maybe even 250. However, the movie only made about $80 million at the box office, about half of its production budget. Now, that is bad, and it sounds bad, but it's even worse than you think. After the catastrophic flop of the movie, the dust settled as it exited theaters, and it was then reported that Mortal Engines had lost to Universal Pictures an absolutely baffling $174.8 million.
Sorry.
Which not only makes it the biggest box office flop of 2018 by far, but it also makes it one of the biggest box office bombs in the history of cinema. At the time of making this video, it is the 5th biggest flop of all time. And nowadays, this is pretty much the only reason why people even know about this movie. Most people who have heard of Mortal Engines have absolutely no idea what this movie even is. They just know it as that movie that bombed real hard. It also didn't help that Universal had the brilliant idea to release the movie on the same weekend as Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I think the studio execs genuinely believed they wouldn't have any trouble going against an animated movie. And boy, how did that work out for you? Naturally, the sequels were immediately cancelled, and by the time the new year rolled around a couple weeks after its release, Mortal Engines had already vanished from the people's consciousness. Now, I haven't read the source material, so if you're watching this video and you're a fan of the Mortal Engines novels, please feel free to jump into the comments and let me know what it was like for you to see this movie and how you experienced this whole debacle. I don't know if it was an accurate adaptation or if they completely fucked it up, and I don't know if fans of the book loved this movie, so let me know. I'm actually really curious about that. But yeah, long story short, a movie bound to flop ended up flopping so hard that it is now a historic failure of cinema. But wait till you hear about the final entry. The entry that is the story behind why I'm even making this video. Number 1. The Dark Universe. This one is very particular and it always makes me laugh. The Dark Universe might be one of the most embarrassing endeavors to ever happen in Hollywood. And yes, it is the story I mentioned at the very beginning of this video. So I know that for those of you who have been following the world of movies for the past 10-ish years, you know what this is. But a lot of people who will watch this have no idea. So please, allow me to give you the breakdown. Sit back, get some popcorn, and unclench your butt cheeks because this is gonna be a ride. So, in 1999, there's a tiny little movie that came out. You might have heard of it. It's called The Mummy, with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. You again? This movie is an absolute blast, an action-adventure film that defines its era, okay? Not to sound like a boomer or anything, but they really do not make them like this anymore. And 2 years later, in 2001, we got the sequel, The Mummy Returns. And together, they form what I consider to be one of the greatest film duologies of all time. I said what I said, you can fucking quote me. The Mummy and The Mummy Returns are, to me, the embodiment of fun cinema. I love these movies with a passion. The Mummy Returns was my favorite movie of all time as a child. Fun fact, as a kid, I watched this movie so often that my dad had to confiscate it from me because that's literally all I would do with my days. Watch this movie over and over again. I know The Mummy Returns like the back of my own hand. I know almost every line in this film by heart. It has some of my favorite comedic moments ever. Oh my god, I need to make a video about it. I need to make a video about these movies. That's a thought for later, but let's get back to the point. The Mummy and The Mummy Returns are fucking monuments, and I cherish these films with every atom in my being. Anyways, then there was a third film in 2008 that fucking sucked. It's called The Mummy and the Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. It was bad. Very, very bad. It was a mess. The story was lame. The vibe was lame. Rachel Weisz didn't come back for it and was replaced by Maria Bello, who just cannot do justice to a character like Evie. And the movie introduces a new antagonist played by Jet Li that feels completely out of place in this franchise. Long story short, The Mummy 3 was a major misstep. It sucked. sucked, everybody hated it, but it did do really well at the box office. So, despite being a pretty substantial failure in terms of critical response and audience reception, Universal decided to go ahead with a fourth movie. And by 2010, The Mummy 4 was in active development, with Brendan Fraser and Maria Bello set to return. But then, about 2 years later, something happened. Something absolutely massive happened. Something that changed everything for Hollywood. Something that ushered in an absurd amount of transformations to the entire industry, the effects of which we are still exposed to today. And that thing was this. In 2012, Marvel released The Avengers, and in a blink of an eye, it became the highest-grossing movie of all time, beating James Cameron's Avatar. It completely shook pop culture, it completely shook Hollywood to its core, but most of all, it got the attention of every other studio in the industry, including Universal. Yes, it's them again. Suddenly, all the priorities in Hollywood shifted under the regime of the MCU and the just absolutely abhorrent amount of money it was generating. Every studio developed an instant obsession with the concept of cinematic universes, which they perceived as the elevation, the next level of franchises. All of those executives had dollar signs in their eyes. They all thought if they made interconnected movies like Marvel, they could also sway audiences and make billions of dollars several times a year. So for the next couple of years, studios gathered every major franchise and iconic characters they had the rights to in order to craft their own cinematic universes and catch up to Disney and Marvel. Warner Brothers owned the rights to DC Comics characters, so they immediately got to work on a franchise reboot with Man of Steel, which came out a year later and kickstarted the DCEU. They also did it on television with the Arrowverse, and they also ventured into horror by expanding their 2013 success The Conjuring into its own cinematic universe comprised of sequels and numerous spin-offs. Legendary Pictures created the Monsterverse, which was kicked off in 2014 with the Godzilla reboot that eventually led to the Godzilla x Kong franchise that is still running to this day. Sony tried to capitalize on the MCU by using the Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield to introduce different spin-offs, but that failed, and they pivoted to creating a brand new cinematic universe loosely connected to the MCU and comprised of Marvel villains they still had the rights to. That's how we got the Venomverse, including the likes of Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven the Hunter, all three of which were embarrassing box office bombs, and Kraven was the movie that officially killed the cinematic universe because Sony got a little humiliated and canceled the whole thing. And then there was Universal. Universal didn't have much to work with. They had the Fast and Furious franchise, which in 2012 had just had a sort of renaissance with the overwhelming success of Fast 5 that gave a new life to the saga, but that was kind of it. Universal didn't have the rights to any interesting comic book characters they could try to build something with. They didn't have big movie potential with icons like Godzilla or King Kong or anything like that. So they kept wondering, like, what can we use? And then they realized, we have the rights to some classic monsters of cinema, and those we don't have the rights to are now public domain. Frankenstein, we have that. The Invisible Man, we have that. The Wolfman, The Bride, Creature from the Black Lagoon, we got all of that. We can do something with that. We can revive all of these characters in a new cinematic universe around these vintage horror villains. We even got The Mummy. So, In 2012, after the release of The Avengers, Universal decided to cancel The Mummy 4 and announced a reboot that would be part of a new franchise. And then they got to work. They made a plan for their new cinematic universe. They wanted it to be big, to be epic, and they cracked it. They knew exactly where to start because of all the classic horror villains of cinema. If there is one that everybody will know, it's Dracula. So in 2014, Universal Pictures inaugurated their brand new cinematic universe with their reimagining of the classic antagonist, titled Dracula Untold. And it flopped so hard that they canceled the entire franchise like immediately. I'm not kidding. This movie was a real embarrassment for the studio. It bombed to a degree that was so incredibly insane that it was pretty much wiped from existence alarmingly fast. Because you have to understand, this movie was a big deal. It had been announced as their next huge franchise. They really tried to hype this movie up. They really believed this would be a major hit, but it crashed and burned, and the reviews were nothing to smile at, and it just faded into oblivion. Nobody remembers Dracula Untold because Universal made sure of it. Catastrophe, embarrassment, plans canceled, but Universal was not ready to give up on this cinematic universe idea. They just kind of fucked up with the first movie, but they still believed they could pull this off. They still thought they could have their own MCU. So they decided to start from scratch, and this time, they weren't fucking around. They completely rebranded the whole thing. They decided to make a big deal out of it. This time, they were going to market this entire endeavor as a large cinematic universe, and they decided to title it The Dark Universe. And this time, fuck Dracula. They already fucked up with that once. They needed to think outside the box. So they decided to kick off the new version of the cinematic universe with the reboot of The Mummy. And they only had one rule to follow. Just do everything Marvel did. Copy everything. Who gives a fuck that every character in this franchise are horror villains? Fuck horror. Tried that, didn't work. Let's make a bunch of action movies. Let's make absolutely everything in there catered to the largest amount of people possible. The new plan is to do everything like Marvel so we can have the ultimate crowd-pleasing films. And to populate these films, we're gonna need a cast full of recognizable faces to get more excitement. And guys, when I tell you they took this shit seriously, I am not kidding. They were not fucking around. Universal marketed the shit out of the Dark Universe. They announced a massive, stacked to hell and back cast. Tom Cruise as the lead of The Mummy, Sofia Boutella as the Mummy, Javier Bardem as the Frankenstein monster, Angelina Jolie as the Bride of Frankenstein, Johnny Depp as the Invisible Man, Russell Crowe as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of them were gonna get their own movies and then be united in one large movie, just like the Avengers, and there were a bunch of movies officially announced on top of that. Van Helsing, Phantom of the Opera, a new Dracula down the line. It was batshit. They even went as far as premiering an official photo of the Dark Universe cast in Variety to get everyone hyped and create more buzz around the project. They went as far as creating an alternate logo card for the movies, where the Universal logo would then be followed by a Dark Universe logo on the other side of the planet. It was very clear that Universal wanted everybody to pay attention, and people did. And in 2017, after 5 years of wait, the reboot of The Mummy, the first movie of the brand new Universal Dark Universe finally came out in theaters. And it was a monumental disaster. And I mean monumental. A failure of an absurd scale, so much so that it was kind of hard to believe. Somehow, the Mummy reboot of 2017 flopped even harder than Dracula Untold, except this time, they couldn't swipe it under the rug. They had made too much noise. They had pushed this whole thing way too hard. They made it such a big deal that it was impossible not to notice the disaster that first movie was. And critics and audiences did not hold back when it came to their opinions. The Mummy reboot is one of the most soulless movies I've ever seen. Just a corporate-ass blockbuster with no identity that doesn't even know what it wants to be. The story is uninteresting. The characters are all overwhelmingly flat and forgettable. The tone is all over the place because it's trying to be a Marvel movie, but it's also trying to be a dark monster movie, but it's also trying to be funny, and everything just comes out incredibly inconsistent. It's a movie that tries to be silly, but that simultaneously takes itself way too seriously, and that is so afraid to be anything daring or slightly different than the most generic blockbuster of all time that it somehow forgot to be fun. The plot is constantly being sidelined in an effort to create the cinematic universe instead of just starting with one good movie. The connective tissue trying to tie into future spin-offs were fucking laughable. It is so blatant how hard they're just trying to emulate everything Marvel. Dr. Jekyll is the head of a bullshit secret organization called Prodigium that hunts down supernatural threats, aka Dr. Jekyll is Nick Fury and Prodigium is S.H.I.E.L.D. He was gonna be the guy to assemble the Monster Avengers and blah blah blah. And then the movie tries to end with a sort of cliffhanger teasing the future of Tom Cruise's character, who was set to be returning in other films. The whole thing was a clusterfuck of half-baked ideas with bad writing and bad characters, and nothing made any sense whatsoever. And the result? Well, a whole lot of public humiliation for the studio, an audience that immediately lost interest in the universe, and a box office failure that lost Universal upwards of $95 million. The movie came out in June of 2017, and by the end of that year, every creative, filmmaker, and producer attached to the Dark Universe exited the project, and by January of 2018, it was confirmed that the Dark Universe had been cancelled after only one movie. And then Universal, with its tail between its legs, quietly redirected the rights of these characters into small budget films with no relation to one another. They're all pretty bad except for The Invisible Man with Elizabeth Moss that came out in 2020. That was pretty solid, but the rest ranges from forgettable to atrocious, and I'm pretty sure all of them have been box office flops as well. It has been 8 years since the crushing failure of the Mummy reboot, and since then, Universal has made no attempts to build any other kind of cinematic universe.